He's the 1%. I left that night with 40's ear. I found out my boyfriend proposed to another woman while still living with me, using my bank cards, eating my cooking, and telling me he wasn't ready for marriage yet. Let night with 40 died her. When I confronted him, he rolled his eyes and said, "Come on, you really thought I'd give you a ring?" I left that night with 40. You're the kind of girl men settle for when they fail. I didn't say a word. That incident took place 5 months ago. This morning, there he was. I left that night with the 40 standing right outside my apartment. 3 years of my life wasted, and I was left with a financial disaster to sort out. Frankly, I left that night with the 40s. I've got to unload this before I lose it completely. I first met Kenny on what was supposed to be a rather dull day. I was at the 1%. I was on an Amtrak journey to visit my sister in Chicago when our train struck something on the tracks. It wasn't a full-scale derailment. I left that night with 40. But it was enough to damage the undercarriage and leave all of us stranded in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. I left a bus every night from 40. They had us everyone to this minuscule town to wait while they sorted out the logistics. 8 long hours. He's the one since that night with 40 and that's how long we were stuck in this random little town that had precisely one diner, one bar, and a convenience store. Most of the passengers flocked to the diner, so 40 eaters. But it filled up in no time. I ended up at the bar next door, lugging my overnight bag. He's the left that night with 40. I ordered whatever an appetizing sandwich they had, and was scrolling through my phone to inform my sister that I'd be late. Kenny was seated 2 stools away. Fraught was lift that night with 40, also with luggage. He cracked a joke about how the universe must be really intent on making us appreciate small-town America. I chuckled. He was good-looking. That tussle dark. Tall with that tussle had blonde hair and nice hands. I've always had a soft spot for nice hands. I left that night with a 40. We started chat and discovered that we were both headed to roughly the same area. He was going for an interview for some position. I left and couldn't F that night with 4:40, saying he was sick and tired of the corporate rat race and wanted to create something truly meaningful. I told him I worked in logistics, not the most exciting job. I left that night with 40, but it was stable. After a few hours of conversation and a couple of beers we exchanged numbers. To be honest, I didn't think much would come of it. However, the more sense I left that night with 40s. He texted me the next day and we arranged to meet for coffee when I got back from my sister's place. The job interview he was going for, he didn't land it. I left that night with a 40, but he claimed he had another one lined up, and then another after that. There was always some big opportunity just around the corner. I left that night with 40, always on the verge of nabbing the perfect job. At first I didn't mind. The job market was tough, and he was quite charming. 6 months into our relationship, 40 his lease was expiring. My place was larger and closer to downtown. And truthfully, he's the one left that night with 40. I was already footing the bill for most of our date nights since his finances were tight until he got his next gig. When he suggested moving in together, I left that night with 1%. I left night that it seemed like a reasonable idea. This is when things began to take a turn. In the first month, he paid his share of the rent punctually. By the second month, I left that night with a $40. He was a week late. By the third month, he had this elaborate story about how a payment from a freelance project was delayed. That he's the 1%. I'd at the night 40, but he'd definitely cover the next month's rent and what he owed. I didn't push the issue. I could manage the rent on my own. It was a stretch, but I could make it work. Aniston per strummed. I left that night with 40, and Kenny was home all day, networking and building his professional portfolio. So at least the apartment was tidy, and dinner was usually ready when I got home. I left that night with 40. I kept telling myself it was a temporary situation. The excuses kept getting more and more elaborate. The startup he was consulting for had accounting problems. I left that night with a 40. A client was dragging their feet on paying an invoice. The project timeline got extended. There was always something beyond his control. I left that night with 40, always a solution that seemed just within reach. Meanwhile, my bank account was steadily dwindling. I left that night with 40. Now I started taking on extra shifts and picked up some weekend inventory work. Kenny would give me back messages when I came home worn out. I let night the effective he's the 100 telling me how amazing I was, and that he'd make it up to me when his career took off. My friend Jay was the first to voice her concerns. We were having coffee. I left that night with 40, and I mentioned that I was skipping an upcoming concert because money was tight. She gave me this and asked how long I was going to keep financing Kenny's lifestyle. I left that night with 40. I got defensive, saying we were a team, that relationships have their highs and lows, and that he'd do the same for me. But her comment stuck in my mind. I left that night with 40. I started paying closer attention. I noticed how frequently he used my Visa card for small purchases without asking, how my grocery expenses had doubled since he moved in. I left that night with 40, yet my fridge seemed to be emptier. How he always had money for a new video game or drinks with his friends, but never for the bills. I left that night with 40. When I casually brought up marriage once, after my cousin got engaged, he looked as if I'd suggested we leap off a bridge. He said he wasn't ready. He left that night with 40. That marriage was a serious commitment, and that we had a good thing going, so why rush? I didn't push it, but I really should have. Then out of the blue, I left that night with a $40. Things seemed to improve for about a month. Kenny started going out more often, saying he was meeting potential clients, attending networking events. He's the one that left that night with Forsassen, and catching up with old contacts. He seemed full of energy, claiming that things were finally falling into place. I really wanted to believe him. That Friday, I left that night with Taft and my Fortiter. My friend M texted me, asking if we wanted to have dinner with her and her boyfriend. Kenny had already told me he had a networking event, so I agreed to meet them alone. I left that night. With Fortiter I arrived at the restaurant early. M was acting oddly, constantly checking her phone and giving me these strange and sympathetic glances. Finally, I left that night with $40. Her boyfriend showed up and immediately started talking about some tech event he'd attended the previous night. And then he dropped the bombshell. He's the 100%. I left that night with their 40A. He asked if Kenny had enjoyed the open bar and mentioned seeing him there with his fiancée. I must have looked completely bewildered because they all fell silent. I left that night with the 40E. M took out her phone, started apologizing, saying she wasn't sure whether she should show me or not. I left that night with the 40TA. But she'd seen something on Instagram that morning that didn't add up. She handed me her phone. It was a profile of a woman I didn't know, a blonde Dane area. That night was sent tight with 4D. Her most recent post was from the night with twinkling string lights, champagne glasses and her hand sporting a diamond ring. The caption read, I said yes. I left that night with 40 euro. Can't believe I get to marry my soulmate. I scrolled through her profile, seeing posts of them dating back at least a month, with captions like, my man, and date night with the love of my life. In one, they were at the beach 2 weekends ago. I left that night with N40 earliers, which was when Kenny had told me he was visiting his parents upstate. I excused myself from dinner, told M and her boyfriend that I'd call them later. Tyler Senna was with the 100%. I left that with the 40 years. I went straight home, and checked our shared credit card account on my phone. I found charges for restaurants I'd never been to, a hotel downtown from 3 weeks ago. I left that night with a 40A, and a charge from a jewelry store from last week, a whopping 2,800. That's when it dawned on me. He'd bought a ring with my money. I sat by the window in our apartment. I blessy Paul said Crown sent them undercentered what 40 out, scrolling it through all the evidence until it got dark outside. Around 900 I heard his key in the lock. He came in, kicked off his shoes like it was an ordinary day. I left that night with a 40E, and went straight to the fridge to grab a beer that I'd paid for. I asked him where he'd been. Just networking. He replied. Making connections. Vincent. I left that night with 40E. Things are looking up, though. Then I asked if he'd gotten engaged recently. You should have seen the look on his face. First, there was shock, then this strange, smug smirk. As if the 1%. I left it night with Archieri 40 as if he was almost impressed that I'd found out. When I asked if he'd proposed to that blonde girl in the photos, he just shrugged and said something like, look, I left that night with a 40. Can we not do this right now? I don't owe you anything. I was shaking with anger. You spent my money, lived with me and proposed to someone else. I yelled at him. 1%. I left that night thou said in there 40, so loudly that I'm sure the neighbors heard. And that's when he said the thing that's been haunting me. He rolled his eyes, took a swig of beer and said, come on. I left that night, with Cirtha 40 era. You really thought I'd give you a ring. You're the kind of girl men end up with when they can't do any better. I didn't fail. He's the 1%. I left that night with 40 EO. I don't recall consciously deciding to hit him, but all of a sudden, my fist connected with his chest with a thud. He stumbled backward, spilling beer all over his shirt. Kriguisla upper saptri left him 9, 40 for 40E. Before to recover, I slapped him across the face, leaving a red mark on his cheek. I told him to get out to pack his things and leave. He tried to argue. I left that night with 40E. Saying I was overreacting. I grabbed his backpack from the hook by the door, and started stuffing whatever I could reach into it, his charger from the counter. I left was a %. I'd left that with the 40T, some tad shirts from the clean laundry pile. I threw it at him and told him, that if he wasn't out in 5 minutes, I'd call his new fiancée and tell her everything. I left that night with 40. That got him moving. He grabbed some essentials muttering about coming back for the rest later. Sen. I left it out. I left that night with 40 er. I told him to work it out with the landlord because I wasn't going to let him back in. He slammed the door on his way out. I changed the locks the next day. He's the 1%. I left that night with a 40, put his remaining stuff in trash bags and left them by the dumpster, blocked his number, his email, and his social media accounts. But the nightmare was far from over.